Sometimes the night that feels like the lowest point of your life is actually the moment your future quietly begins. Ethan Carter used to repeat that line to himself on the long walk home after work, though most nights it sounded more like a wish than a truth. At 23 years old, Ethan's life was measured not in dreams or plans, but in unpaid bills and exhausting shifts. The small one-bedroom apartment he rented on the edge of the city smelled faintly of instant noodles and laundry detergent, the scent of survival. The wallpaper was peeling near the window, and the heater rattled like it had something to complain about every winter night. But it was the only place he could afford after his father passed away, leaving behind something far heavier than grief. Debt. More than Ethan could even imagine paying off when he first saw the numbers printed on the paper. His father had been a good man, but illness had drained every dollar they had. Hospital bills, borrowed money, unpaid loans. When everything was totaled, the amount felt impossible. Still, Ethan refused to run from it. Every day he woke before sunrise and returned home long after midnight, juggling 3 different jobs just to keep the collectors from knocking on his door. In the mornings he stocked shelves at a small grocery store. In the afternoons he cleaned tables at a diner off Highway 17 where truck drivers stopped for coffee. And at night, when most people were relaxing on their couches, Ethan strapped on a worn delivery bag and rode his electric bike across the city delivering food orders. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid by the mile, and every mile meant a few more dollars toward the mountain of debt hanging over his head. The winter air that night cut through his jacket as he pedaled down a quiet street lined with tall iron gates and enormous houses. Ethan glanced at the address glowing on his phone screen, his breath fogging in the cold air. Blackwood Residence. Even people who lived far from the wealthy districts knew that name. Adrian Blackwood, CEO, billionaire, one of the most powerful alpha executives in the entire state. Ethan had heard customers at the diner talk about him before. Cold, brilliant, untouchable. The kind of man whose decisions could move entire companies overnight. The kind of man someone like Ethan Carter would never normally meet. The order in his delivery bag smelled like expensive steak and imported wine. The total amount for the meal probably more than Ethan earned in 2 days of work. He stopped his bike in front of the towering gate, staring up at the massive house beyond it. Warm lights glowed through the tall windows, illuminating polished stone walls and a driveway big enough to park 10 cars. For a moment, Ethan hesitated, suddenly aware of how small he looked standing there with his scuffed sneakers and faded jacket. Then his phone buzzed again with the delivery timer counting down, reminding him that hesitation didn't pay bills. He took a breath and walked up to the front door, lifting his hand to knock. Ethan Carter had no idea that the man on the other side of that door would change his life forever. The front door opened slowly, and warm light spilled across the marble steps, forcing Ethan to blink after the darkness outside. Standing in the doorway was a tall man whose presence seemed to fill the entire entrance hall behind him. Adrian Blackwood looked exactly like the rumors people whispered about in the diner, composed, sharply dressed even late at night, with calm gray eyes that carried a quiet authority that did not need to be announced. For a brief moment neither of them spoke. Ethan suddenly became very aware of the cold air on his cheeks and the delivery bag hanging from his shoulder. Then Adrian stepped aside slightly and said in a calm voice that carried the confidence of someone used to being obeyed, "You must be the delivery." Ethan nodded quickly and held out the bag. "Yes, sir. Order for Adrian Blackwood." Adrian accepted it and gestured toward the wide foyer. "Come in for a moment. It is freezing outside." Ethan hesitated because delivery drivers were usually not invited into houses like this, but the winter wind pushed against his back, and he stepped inside. The warmth wrapped around him instantly. The house was enormous, with high ceilings, polished floors, and a quiet stillness that made Ethan feel as if he had walked into another world entirely. Adrian set the food on a long kitchen counter and opened a bottle of wine that had already been sitting there. The scent of rich food and expensive alcohol filled the air. Ethan tried not to stare, but the difference between this place and his tiny apartment felt almost unreal. Adrian glanced at him again, noticing the tired circles under Ethan's eyes and the thin jacket that clearly was not enough for the season. "You look exhausted," Adrian said matter-of-factly. Ethan gave a small, embarrassed laugh. "Just a long shift. I still have a few deliveries left tonight." Adrian poured a small glass of wine and offered it without thinking, a casual gesture that someone like him might make automatically. Ethan almost refused out of habit, But the warmth of the house and the gentle haze of the evening made him accept. The wine was smooth and stronger than anything Ethan had ever tasted before. They spoke only a little after that. Simple conversation about work, the cold weather, and the quiet city outside. But the air between them slowly changed as the minutes passed. Ethan noticed a faint scent in the room that he could not ignore, something warm and powerful that made his thoughts feel slightly unsteady. Adrian noticed it too, the subtle sweetness in the air that told his instincts the young man standing in his kitchen was an Omega. Neither of them had planned for the moment that followed. It was simply a quiet shift in the atmosphere, a mixture of fatigue, alcohol, and the natural pull between Alpha and Omega that neither of them fully resisted. The night outside deepened while the city lights glowed through the tall windows. Hours seemed to pass without either of them noticing. By the time the sky began to lighten faintly at the horizon, Ethan realized he had fallen asleep on the soft couch in the living room. Panic rushed through him as he sat up. His phone showed several missed delivery alerts. The house was silent. Adrian was nowhere in sight. Embarrassment burned across Ethan's face as he quietly gathered his bag and slipped out the front door into the pale morning light. He told himself it had simply been a strange accident, a moment that would never matter again. But inside the quiet mansion behind him, Adrian Blackwood stood by the window holding a cup of coffee, staring at the empty driveway with an expression he rarely showed anyone. For reasons he could not explain, he knew that the Omega who had just left would not be easy to forget. 1 month passed quietly after the strange night at the mansion, but Ethan Carter could not shake the feeling that something inside his life had shifted in a way he did not yet understand. At first he tried to ignore it. His days continued the same as before, long hours at the grocery store in the morning, the diner in the afternoon, and food deliveries across the city late into the night. The routine left him so exhausted that most evenings he barely remembered falling asleep on the narrow mattress in his apartment. Still, something was different. It began with small things. A sudden wave of dizziness when he stood too quickly. The smell of fried food at the diner making his stomach twist in ways that never happened before. One morning while stacking canned soup on a grocery shelf, Ethan had to grip the metal rack because the room seemed to tilt slightly. His coworker asked if he was feeling sick, but Ethan forced a quick smile and said he had simply skipped breakfast. In truth, he had eaten, but lately food seemed to behave strangely around him. Some days he was hungrier than usual, while other days even the thought of eating made him uneasy. He blamed the stress. Debt collectors had not stopped calling, and every time his phone rang with an unknown number, his chest tightened with worry. The last thing he needed was a medical problem that would cost more money he did not have. But after several weeks of persistent nausea and exhaustion that felt deeper than normal fatigue, Ethan finally accepted that something was not right. One gray morning before his grocery shift began, he stopped by a small walk-in clinic 2 blocks away from the bus station. The building was plain and smelled faintly of disinfectant and coffee from the waiting room machine. Ethan sat in a plastic chair, nervously tapping his fingers against his knee while watching the second hand on the wall clock tick forward. When the nurse finally called his name, he followed her down a narrow hallway and answered a series of routine questions. Most of them felt ordinary until the doctor returned with a clipboard and a calm expression that seemed almost too careful. The doctor looked at Ethan over the edge of the chart and spoke gently. "Ethan, your test results are clear. You are healthy, but there is something you need to know." Ethan felt his stomach tighten again as he waited. The doctor continued with quiet certainty. "You are pregnant." For a moment the words did not make sense. Ethan blinked slowly as if the sentence might rearrange itself into something more reasonable. But the doctor repeated it kindly, explaining the timeline, the early stage, and the signs that had brought him into the clinic. The room suddenly felt smaller. Ethan's thoughts rushed backward to a single memory he had tried not to examine too closely. The large house. The quiet conversation. The alpha with calm gray eyes who had offered him a glass of wine on a freezing winter night. Adrian Blackwood. Ethan's hands trembled slightly as he held the edge of the chair. There was no confusion about who the father had to be. The realization settled slowly into his chest like a weight that was both frightening and strangely fragile at the same time. The doctor spoke about health, rest, and future appointments, but Ethan barely heard the details. His mind was already racing ahead to the reality waiting outside the clinic doors. He was 23 years old, already drowning in debt, working 3 jobs just to survive. And now he was going to have a child. By the time Ethan stepped back onto the cold sidewalk, he had already made the decision that felt like the only possible choice. Adrian Blackwood would never know. Ethan would keep the secret, work harder if he had to, and raise the baby on his own. Across the city, Adrian Blackwood stood in the quiet glass office at the top floor of Blackwood Corporation, watching the late afternoon skyline stretch across the horizon like a sea of steel and light. Normally his schedule left little room for distractions. Meetings, acquisitions, negotiations, decisions that affected thousands of employees filled every hour of his day with ruthless precision. Adrian had built his reputation on control and clarity. Nothing lingered in his mind once it was finished. Except this time something had. It had been more than a month since the night the young delivery Omega had stepped through the doors of his house, carrying a bag of takeout and the exhausted weight of the world on his shoulders. Adrian had told himself it was nothing unusual, just an unexpected evening that neither of them had planned. Yet every morning when he woke, the memory returned with surprising clarity. The faint scent of rain and honey that had filled the air that night lingered in his thoughts in a way that made no logical sense. Adrian did not enjoy unanswered questions, and this one had begun to irritate him more than he wanted to admit. A quiet knock sounded at the door before his assistant, Daniel Reed, stepped inside carrying a tablet. Daniel had worked for Adrian for years and knew better than to waste time with small talk. "You asked for the delivery company records from last month," Daniel said. Adrian turned from the window. "Did you find anything useful?" Daniel scrolled through several files before answering. The order was placed through a third-party delivery service. Drivers change frequently. There is no direct employee list tied to your address that night. Adrian frowned slightly, something that rarely happened during business conversations. Someone delivered the food. That means someone exists in the system. Daniel nodded patiently. "We are checking GPS logs and payment routes, but it may take time." Adrian walked slowly back toward his desk, his thoughts briefly returning to the image of the young Omega standing in the doorway that winter night, his cheeks red from the cold, and his voice polite despite clear exhaustion. The memory felt unusually vivid. Adrian rarely noticed people outside his professional circle, yet something about that brief meeting had remained fixed in his mind like a puzzle piece that did not belong anywhere else. "Keep searching," Adrian said calmly. "Someone knows who he is." Daniel raised an eyebrow with quiet curiosity, but did not question the order. After he left the office, Adrian sat alone in the silence again. The city below moved constantly, cars sliding through traffic and lights flickering across glass towers, but Adrian's attention drifted elsewhere. He could still remember the quiet moment early that morning when he had stood by the living room window with a cup of coffee and watched the delivery bike disappear down the driveway. The Omega had left without a word, slipping away as if he had never meant to stay in the first place. Adrian was not used to people leaving without explanation. In his world, everyone wanted something from him: contracts, opportunities, influence. Yet the young Omega had asked for nothing and vanished before Adrian even knew his name. That fact alone made the mystery more difficult to ignore. Adrian leaned back slightly in his chair, tapping his fingers once against the desk before speaking quietly to the empty room. "Find him." It was not spoken with urgency or anger, only quiet certainty. Somewhere in the city, the Omega from that winter night was living an ordinary life, unaware that one of the most powerful alpha executives in the state had just decided that the search would not end until the truth was found. The weeks after leaving the clinic passed slowly for Ethan Carter, each day blending into the next with the same exhausting rhythm he had always known, but now every step felt heavier because he carried a secret that no one else could see. At first, the pregnancy was only a quiet thought in the back of his mind, something fragile and almost unreal, but as time moved forward the signs became harder to ignore. His body tired more quickly than before, and long hours on his electric bike left him dizzy if he pushed himself too far. Still, stopping was not an option. Every dollar he earned still went toward the debt his father had left behind, and now another responsibility was growing quietly inside him. Ethan often placed a hand against his stomach late at night when he returned to his apartment, whispering soft promises to the child that had not yet been born. He told the baby that everything would be fine, even though he was not entirely sure how he would make that promise true. The only thing he knew for certain was that Adrian Blackwood could never be involved. The man lived in a world so different from Ethan's that their lives might as well belong to separate planets. Telling him would only create complications that Ethan could not afford. So he worked harder, pushing himself through longer shifts and more deliveries, telling himself that determination would somehow be enough. One cold afternoon near the beginning of spring, Ethan accepted a large order from a restaurant across town that promised a higher delivery fee than usual. The address was nearly 8 miles away, and the wind pushed against him as he pedaled along the busy street. Traffic lights flickered through the gray sky, while cars rushed past in both directions. By the time Ethan reached the final intersection, his legs felt weak and his breathing had grown shallow, but he forced himself to keep going because every minute counted toward his earnings. After delivering the food, he turned his bike toward home, planning to rest for a few minutes before his evening diner shift began. But halfway down the block, the world around him seemed to blur unexpectedly. The buildings tilted slightly, and the sounds of traffic faded into a dull echo in his ears. Ethan slowed his bike and tried to steady himself, taking a deep breath the way the doctor had suggested when he felt lightheaded. For a moment it worked. Then the dizziness returned stronger than before. His vision dimmed at the edges as if someone had slowly turned down the brightness of the entire world. Ethan stepped off the bike and leaned against a nearby street lamp, hoping the feeling would pass. Pedestrians walked by, without noticing the pale young man trying to stay upright on the sidewalk. He told himself he only needed a few seconds to recover. But the exhaustion that had been building inside him for weeks finally caught up all at once. Ethan's knees buckled slightly, and before he could stop it, the ground rushed up toward him in a blur of gray pavement and distant voices. The last thing he felt was the cold surface beneath his hands as everything faded into silence, unaware that the moment his strength finally gave out would soon bring his path back across the life of the alpha he had tried so hard to leave behind. When Ethan Carter finally opened his eyes again, the first thing he noticed was the steady beeping sound somewhere near his head and the faint smell of antiseptic in the air. For several seconds he did not understand where he was. The ceiling above him was bright white and unfamiliar, and soft morning light filtered through a window across the room. Slowly the memory returned to him in fragments. The long bike ride, the dizziness, the street lamp he had tried to hold on to before the world faded away. Panic stirred in his chest as he pushed himself slightly upright, his hand immediately moving toward his stomach as if he needed to confirm that everything was still there. A calm voice spoke from the doorway before he could gather his thoughts. "You should lie back down. The doctor said you need rest." Ethan turned his head toward the voice and froze. Standing near the foot of the hospital bed was Adrian Blackwood. The alpha looked exactly the same as Ethan remembered, composed, tall, and impossibly calm even inside the quiet hospital room. For a moment neither of them spoke. Ethan felt a sudden urge to look away, embarrassed and confused about how the man had appeared here at the exact moment he had hoped to remain invisible. Adrian stepped closer with measured steps. "You collapsed on the sidewalk 2 blocks from the financial district," he said in a steady voice. "Someone recognized the delivery company logo on your jacket and called an ambulance." Ethan's mind struggled to catch up with the explanation. "But how did you?" Adrian answered before he could finish the question. "My office building is across the street from the hospital. One of my employees saw you being brought in and recognized you from the description I had given them." Ethan's heart sank slightly. The search Adrian had ordered weeks ago had finally worked. He looked down at the blanket covering his legs, suddenly unsure what to say. Silence filled the room again until the door opened and a doctor stepped inside, holding a tablet. The doctor nodded politely to Adrian before turning to Ethan with a professional smile. "Good news. You are stable now. The fainting spell was most likely caused by exhaustion and dehydration." However, the doctor paused briefly while reviewing the chart. "There is something important that should not be ignored." Ethan felt his pulse quicken. The doctor continued calmly. "You are several weeks pregnant, and that means your body requires significantly more rest and nutrition than you have been getting." The room seemed to grow very quiet after those words. Ethan's eyes widened as he slowly turned his head toward Adrian. For a brief moment, the alpha's expression remained unreadable. Then Adrian looked back at the doctor. "Is the child healthy?" The question came so naturally that Ethan felt his breath catch in surprise. The doctor nodded. "Everything appears normal so far. But stress and overwork could create complications if nothing changes." After the doctor left, the silence returned again, heavier than before. Ethan stared at the blanket while his thoughts raced, wondering how to explain something he had planned to keep hidden forever. Adrian finally spoke, his voice calm, but unmistakably certain. "You are carrying my child." It was not a question. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, knowing there was no longer any way to deny the truth. Adrian stepped closer to the bed, his gray eyes softer than Ethan had ever seen them before. You should have told me. Ethan swallowed slowly before answering with quiet honesty. I did not think someone like you would want to know. Adrian studied him for a long moment before responding. You are wrong about that. The quiet hospital room remained still long after Adrian's words settled into the air. Ethan Carter kept his eyes lowered, unsure how to respond to the calm certainty in the Alpha's voice. For weeks he had prepared himself to face the future alone, telling himself again and again that it was the only realistic path. Now that future had suddenly shifted in a way he had never planned. Adrian remained standing beside the bed, his posture composed yet noticeably different from the distant businessman Ethan remembered from that winter night. There was something steadier in his expression now, something thoughtful rather than indifferent. After several moments Adrian spoke again, his tone practical but unexpectedly gentle. You cannot continue working the way you have been. The doctor made that very clear. Ethan looked up immediately, shaking his head instinctively. I have to work. I still owe money. If I stop now the collectors will come back. Adrian studied him carefully, as if weighing every word before answering. The debt you are worried about can be handled. Ethan blinked in confusion. Handled how? Adrian's reply came simply. I will take care of it. The sentence felt so casual that Ethan almost thought he had misheard. For Adrian Blackwood, it might have been a small decision, but for Ethan the idea felt impossible. He had spent months measuring every dollar, calculating every payment, trying to survive 1 week at a time. The thought that someone could erase that weight so easily made him uncomfortable. You do not need to do that, Ethan said quietly. Adrian shook his head once. It is not charity. It is responsibility. The word responsibility lingered in the room with quiet meaning. Ethan's hand moved unconsciously to his stomach again, and Adrian noticed the gesture immediately. For the first time since entering the room, Adrian allowed a faint smile to appear, subtle but genuine. You are not alone in this anymore. Ethan did not know how to respond to that. His life had never included anyone powerful enough to say such things with complete certainty. Before he could answer, Adrian continued speaking in the same calm tone. When the hospital discharges you tomorrow, you will not return to your apartment. Ethan's eyes widened. What do you mean? Adrian explained without hesitation. You will stay at my house. The doctor said you need rest, proper meals, and a stable environment. That will not happen if you continue riding a delivery bike across the city every night. Ethan's first instinct was to refuse. The idea of living in that enormous house felt overwhelming, like stepping into a world that had never been meant for him. But the memory of collapsing on the sidewalk only hours earlier reminded him how fragile his strength had become. Adrian seemed to sense the conflict on Ethan's face. His voice softened slightly as he added, This is not about control. It is about making sure both of you are safe. Ethan slowly exhaled, realizing that every argument he had prepared in his mind suddenly felt weaker than the quiet logic Adrian presented. Outside the hospital window, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the city streets. For the first time since learning about the baby, Ethan allowed himself to imagine a future that did not involve facing everything alone. Adrian pulled a chair closer to the bed and sat down, his expression steady as he looked at Ethan. We will figure the rest out together, he said calmly, and for the first time Ethan began to believe that might actually be possible. The ride from the hospital to Adrian Blackwood's mansion was quiet. But for Ethan Carter it felt like crossing an invisible border between two completely different worlds. The car moved smoothly through the city streets while the evening lights flickered across the windows, reflecting softly against the polished interior. Ethan sat carefully in the back seat, his hands resting protectively over his stomach as he tried to understand how his life had changed so quickly. Only 2 days earlier he had been struggling to finish delivery shifts and counting coins for bus fare. Now he was being driven to the home of one of the most powerful Alpha executives in the state. When the car finally passed through the tall iron gates of the Blackwood estate, Ethan felt the same nervous awe he had experienced the first night he arrived there. The mansion stood tall against the fading sunset, its warm lights glowing through the tall windows as if welcoming them home. Adrian stepped out first and walked around to open Ethan's door, a gesture that caught Ethan slightly off guard. Take your time, Adrian said calmly. Ethan nodded and stepped carefully onto the driveway, feeling the cool spring air against his face. Inside the house, everything felt quiet and organized, The kind of quiet that came from a place where every detail had been carefully managed. A housekeeper greeted them politely before disappearing down the hallway, already aware of Adrian's instructions. Ethan followed Adrian upstairs where a large guest room had been prepared. The space was bright, with wide windows, soft blankets, and a small tray of fruit and tea placed neatly on the table beside the bed. Adrian paused in the doorway and spoke in the same steady tone he used during business meetings, except now there was something warmer in his voice. "You will stay here. The doctor will visit later this week to check on your health." Ethan looked around the room, overwhelmed by the comfort of it all. "You really did not have to do this," he said quietly. Adrian leaned against the doorframe with a thoughtful expression. "I did," he replied simply. Over the following weeks, Ethan slowly adjusted to the new rhythm of life inside the mansion. For the first time in months, he was able to sleep without setting an alarm for the next shift. Regular meals appeared at the table each morning, and the quiet garden outside became his favorite place to sit when the afternoon sun warmed the stone paths. Adrian's schedule remained busy, but he made a habit of checking on Ethan each evening after returning from the office. Sometimes their conversations were simple, discussing how Ethan felt that day or what the doctor had recommended. Other nights Adrian brought home small things he thought might help, books about pregnancy, vitamins, or comfortable blankets for the colder evenings. At first, Ethan remained cautious, unsure how to accept such steady care from someone who had once felt like a distant stranger. But Adrian's actions never felt forced or impatient. He simply stayed nearby, attentive in quiet ways that slowly built trust. One evening while they were sitting in the living room, Ethan felt a small movement beneath his hand for the first time. His eyes widened in surprise as he looked down at his stomach. Adrian noticed immediately and leaned forward with quiet curiosity. "Did something happen?" Ethan nodded slowly, a small smile appearing for the first time in weeks. "I think the baby just moved." Adrian placed his hand gently beside Ethan's, his expression softer than Ethan had ever seen it before. In that quiet moment neither of them spoke, but the connection between them felt stronger than words. For the first time Ethan realized that what had begun as an unexpected night was slowly turning into something far more meaningful. By the time autumn arrived, the trees surrounding the Blackwood estate had begun to turn shades of gold and amber, their leaves drifting quietly across the stone pathways that Ethan Carter now walked each morning. Life had changed so much in the past several months that sometimes he had to pause and remind himself that it was all real. The young Omega who once raced across the city delivering food in the cold night air now spent his days preparing for the arrival of a child he had once believed he would raise alone. Inside the mansion, the atmosphere had slowly transformed as well. What had once been a quiet and carefully controlled house now carried a new sense of anticipation. A small nursery had been prepared in a sunny room overlooking the garden, with soft blankets, a wooden crib, and shelves filled with tiny clothes that Adrian had chosen with surprising attention to detail. Ethan often stood in the doorway looking at the room, amazed that someone as busy and powerful as Adrian Blackwood had taken the time to think about things so small and gentle. Adrian's work schedule remained demanding, but his priorities had clearly shifted. No matter how late he returned from the office, he always checked on Ethan before ending the day. Sometimes they talked quietly in the living room, discussing the baby's progress or simply enjoying the peaceful silence that had grown comfortable between them. Other nights Adrian would sit beside Ethan on the garden bench, listening while Ethan spoke about his childhood memories or the worries he still carried about the future. Slowly the distance that had once existed between them disappeared, replaced by trust built through countless small moments. When the first winter snow began to fall again, the day Ethan had been both nervous and excited about finally arrived. The hospital room was warm and calm, and several hours later a quiet cry filled the air as their child entered the world. Adrian stood beside the bed, holding the small newborn in his arms with an expression that none of his business partners had ever seen before. The powerful alpha who commanded boardrooms and negotiations now looked completely focused on the tiny life resting against his chest. Ethan watched them with tears of relief and happiness shining in his eyes. "He is perfect," Ethan whispered softly. Adrian nodded, carefully placing the baby into Ethan's arms before sitting beside the bed. For a moment they both looked down at the child who had unexpectedly brought their lives together. The baby's small fingers curled gently, as if reaching for the warmth around him. Adrian then looked at Ethan with the same calm certainty that had first convinced him to stay months earlier. You once said you believed someone like me would not want to know, Adrian said quietly. Ethan remembered the moment clearly and gave a small, embarrassed smile. Adrian continued, his voice steady but sincere. Now I cannot imagine my life without either of you. Ethan felt the truth in those words as he looked between Adrian and the baby resting peacefully in his arms. What had started as an unexpected encounter on a cold winter night had slowly become something neither of them had planned, but both of them now treasured. In that quiet hospital room, surrounded by the soft glow of the evening lights, Ethan finally understood that the future he had feared so deeply had turned into something far stronger than he had ever hoped for. A family built not from perfect circumstances, but from two people who chose to stay.